In 2009, a man working in a national park in New Mexico noticed strange ovals in the white gypsum. Not bones, not tools, just dents in fossilized mud. Then it turned out those dents were older than anyone thought possible, and because of them, the history of an entire continent had to be rewritten. What do you know about North America before Europeans arrived? Most likely, you picture empty plains, bison, scattered tribes, and everything real, cities, monuments, complex societies, somewhere else. It's a neat picture, convenient, and far too small for the continent it's trying to explain. Today, we're going to follow the clues that break that picture apart one by one. Human footprints older than the last glacial maximum, a hunter-gatherer city with not a single planted field, an earthwork mound wider at the base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, a metropolis larger than London in its own century, hundreds of miles of desert canals dug without metal tools. And at the end, the main question: how did such a vast and astonishing past get made to look so small? The first clue isn't in a city, it isn't under a temple, it's in white gypsum, white sands, blinding gypsum, dry dunes that look like flour. But under that whiteness, another world was hidden. The shore of an Ice Age lake, wet mud, heavy animals, human feet pressing soft dents into the ground. The lake dried up, the mud hardened, and it held those dents like a signature. Those were the dents no one was in a hurry to call human. Then comes the thing that always happens in archaeology when a find looks too early. It gets tested harder than usual, because if it's real, you have to rearrange the whole room.
The first doubt was simple. Were these even people? A dried lake bed can play tricks with shapes. Sediment cracks, sinks, washes out, leaves stains. But the closer researchers looked at the trackways, the worse that explanation got. The prints had the shape of feet and the logic of walking. The heel pressed deeper, the toes left the front edge, the foot slid slightly in wet ground. Once, mud took the weight of a body and dried in that exact position. These weren't stains, they were steps. Then came the second doubt, and it was much heavier. Fine, maybe people, but how long ago? In 2021, researchers sampled seeds of ditchgrass, a marsh plant that had grown near that lake, from layers just above the tracks and just below them. 2 bookmarks, before the step and after it. Carbon dating gave a number that made the hinges creak on the old version of the past, more than 20,000 years ago. Not 13,000, not 15,000, not neatly beside Clovis, the early culture with its distinctive spear points that was treated for so long almost as the starting line for people in the Americas. White sands went deeper, down into the thickness of the last ice age, when ice sheets were still reshaping the northern part of the continent. And the familiar model, a late arrival south through an ice-free corridor, suddenly became too cramped. Critics went after the weak point, and the attack was fair. It's called the hard water effect. Aquatic plants can sometimes take in carbon not from the air, but from water, where very ancient carbon from rock has dissolved. Then carbon dating gets fooled. On paper, the plant looks older than it is. Ditch grass grew in water. So maybe those 20,000 plus years had been inflated by the lake itself.
In 2023, the team came back. This time, not with one line of evidence, but two independent ones. First, radiocarbon dating of conifer pollen from the same layers. Pollen doesn't grow underwater and doesn't pull in lake chemistry the same way. Second, optical dating. Mineral grains, including quartz, were tested to see when they had last seen sunlight before sediment buried them. Two keys, the same door. The date held, roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. The clue was dragged into bright light, checked from different sides, and it didn't fall apart. It got heavier. But the date is only half the story. The date breaks the timeline. The footprints themselves collapse the distance. At an ordinary archaeological site, the past speaks through dry remains. A stone lay here. A fire burned here. An animal was butchered here. Between the fact and the person, there's a layer of dust. At White Sands, that layer is thinner. The ground preserved not just presence, but behavior. Children jumped in the mud, small prints, disorder, energy. In a world where mammoths and giant ground sloths walked nearby, children were still children, and a puddle was still tempting. Along another trackway, someone carried a toddler for more than half a mile. From time to time, the child was set down. Small prints appear beside the larger ones, then vanish again. On the way back, the adult walks alone. Why they went, who they carried the child to, why they returned without the child, we don't know. What we do know is the rhythm. Body weight, extra burden, stops. More than 20,000 years later, it can still be read. And there's another trackway where a giant ground sloth, leaving huge prints, suddenly rises onto its hind legs and turns near human footprints. Maybe it was defending itself. Maybe it was sizing up a threat. The tracks speak more cautiously than any emotion we might put on them. But even that turn is enough to make the Ice Age stop looking like a museum image and start looking like a place where living beings actually shared the same wet ground. That's why White Sands is dangerous to the old version. Not because one footprint can go on a cover and settle the debate. Science doesn't work that way. It's dangerous because it ties a deep date to ordinary human life. People didn't appear in North America as a dot on a map. They walked, they carried children, they crossed the paths of enormous animals. They left chains of steps in mud. They were inside this world already at a time when the old model didn't expect them to see them there. The earliest chapters of the continent aren't empty. They're populated, moving, already complex. And that's exactly why White Sands doesn't close the page. It opens a new one. If people were here more than 20,000 years ago, how far back did their journey begin? What routes did they take south if the ice-free corridor opened much later? And what do we do with that one neat version of the peopling of the Americas that textbooks held on to for so long? Here's the ice, here's the corridor, here are people moving down the map.
too neat. And ancient America, as we're already seeing, doesn't like neat answers. If people were in the white gypsum more than 20,000 years ago, how did they get there? And what does that do to the one tidy version that was treated for so long almost like the starting point of human history in the Americas? That version is called Clovis first.
Its logic is clean and elegant. When a corridor finally opened between the two enormous ice sheets that covered almost all of present-day Canada, people moved south through it and spread across both Americas. Their first recognizable culture, according to the model, was Clovis, with its distinctive stone points. Those points are hard to mistake. A narrow channel was removed from the base, the so-called flute, a long flake scar that helped attach the point to a split shaft. They were first properly identified in the 1930s at Blackwater Draw in New Mexico. After that, they began turning up across the continent, often in kill sites, together with mammoth and mastodon bones, sometimes lodged between ribs. That version even had its own person, more precisely, a child. At the Anzick site in Montana, in the only known burial from Clovis times, lay an infant about 1.5 years old. He was placed in the ground around 12,700 years ago, heavily covered with red ochre, with more than 100 objects laid beside him: stone points, bone rods, worked tools, a whole set of things that mattered enough to be buried with a small boy. When his genome was sequenced in 2014, it turned out that he was a close ancestor of a very large share of indigenous peoples living across both Americas today. So the thread from the first people to the present isn't just a poetic phrase, it's literally in the DNA. And remember that thread. We'll come back to it when we reach the people who later built mounds and cities. The boy's bones, by the way, were reburied by his descendants in the same place with ceremony. The signal Clovis gave was real, but the word first is cracking, and there isn't just one crack anymore.
In Pennsylvania, at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, beneath dozens of layered deposits, charcoal and stone flakes lie in levels that some researchers read as roughly 16,000 years old, noticeably earlier than any Clovis date. Far to the south, at Monteverde in Chile, a bog preserved the foundations of huts, worked wood, scraps of hide, and even chewed plants. That site dates to roughly 14,500 years ago, and possibly deeper. And between those two, more cracks appear. In dry Oregon caves, researchers found dried human feces, coprolites, containing human DNA, about 14,000 years old. On a Florida riverbed, stone tools appeared among butchered mastodon bones. In Texas, a separate layer of worked stone was found below a Clovis layer. That only works one way. People had already moved through both Americas significantly earlier than the Clovis first schedule allowed. You don't need to memorize the exact numbers. The point is that the tidy chart breaks in several places at once, and it has been breaking for a long time. Then comes a very awkward question: the corridor itself. That passage between the ice sheets seems to have become ice-free much later than the early timeline would need. And before it opened, it wasn't a friendly trail through snow. It was a bare ice world with no food and no shelter. So attention has increasingly shifted to the western edge of the continent, along the Pacific coast, to what's called the Kelp Highway. Along the western shore stretched underwater forests of kelp. With them came sea otters, fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals, an almost continuous ribbon of food. People could have moved south along it by boat and also on foot near the shore, while inland routes were still held by ice. So the peopling of the Americas wasn't one migration arrow on a map. It wasn't one people, one moment, or one road. It was a long process. People moved. They adjusted to new land. They settled places. They lost routes and found others across enormous spaces and under difficult conditions. The inland corridor may have been part of that process. The coast may have been too. But one single tidy model can't carry the story anymore. Fine. People were here early, and their arrival wasn't simple. But the familiar picture has another claim ready. The spaces between the famous sites, the Great Plains, the corridors between centers, were empty. Places people crossed, not places people inhabited. Was that really true? In 1908, a black cowboy named George McJunkin was riding across a ranch in New Mexico. A heavy rain had just passed through. Water had cut into an arroyo, collapsed its walls, and in the fresh slice of earth, McJunkin noticed bones. Too big for cattle. He wasn't a scientist. He was a formerly enslaved man, self-taught, someone who had spent his life working with land, horses, and stone. Because of that, he could read that ground better than many professors. Excavations began only in the 1920s after his death. And then, at the bottom of the old arroyo, among the bones of an extinct species of bison, archaeologists pulled out a small object that overturned a large debate, a finely worked spear point with long grooves. Not a crude flake, the work of a skilled hand. And it wasn't just somewhere near the bones, it was lodged between the bison's ribs.
One small stone did what years of argument had not. Before it, serious scholars believed humans had appeared in North America very recently, maybe only a few thousand years ago. After this find, known as the Folsom discovery, there was almost nothing left to argue about. That point was in a place it simply couldn't be if the old story was right. People had hunted Ice Age animals here many thousands of years ago. And the location matters, because the Great Plains are exactly what the long, convenient version of history treated as an empty corridor, a space people supposedly crossed on the way to real centers, not a place they inhabited. The Folsom Point put the first crack in that crossed-through idea. Then the crack widened. At Olson Chubbuck in Colorado, around 10,000 years ago, hunters drove nearly 100 bison into a dry arroyo. No horses, no bow, just people, voices, distance, and precise knowledge of how a herd moves and where each person had to stand. Then came the second job, no easier than the first. That mountain of carcasses had to be butchered quickly before the meat spoiled and in an orderly way so nothing valuable was lost. Archaeologists can see that order in the bones themselves. One step, then another, a practiced sequence. From the amount of meat alone, it's clear that a group well over 100 people strong was working in coordination.
This isn't wandering tribes just following herds. This is organized labor of hundreds of people. This is coordination. And there's a quieter clue, easy to miss because it doesn't look like a hunting scene. Stone. Flint quarries on the northern plains, especially Knife River flint in present-day North Dakota, were worked for something like 11,000 years. Generation after generation, people knew where good stone lay. They came to it, knocked off blanks, and carried them away.
Era tools. Many centuries later, it appears in Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio, 1,000 miles to the east. That means the plains weren't an emptiness between other people's networks. They fed those networks. They supplied rare, needed stone. Remember that thread too, a network pulling rare materials across 1,000 miles. We'll come back to it when we reach Hopewell. Much later, on those same plains, cities of their own grew. Along the Missouri River stood fortified villages of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. Outside were palisades and defensive ditches. Inside were hundreds of round earth lodges with 1,000 people or more. An earth lodge isn't a shelter for one night. Its thick walls held off winter cold and summer heat. Inside, people stored food, tools, and supplies for the next season. On river bottoms, they planted corn, beans, squash, and sunflower. On higher ground, they hunted bison. In other words, life here didn't depend on one thing, not one lucky harvest, not one hunt. And the stakes were real. One such town was destroyed in a massacre around 1325. Archaeologists found the dead in the defensive ditch where the line of defense became the place of death. A ditch filled with the killed means something simple. There were walls, there was an attack, there was fear, and there was memory among the people who came after. Several centuries later, Lewis and Clark, heading west, spent the winter near a group of Mandan towns that were larger than St. Louis at the time. They weren't wintering somewhere among Indians at the edge of the map. They were beside a large, crowded city on the Missouri, with houses, stored food, trade, news, and politics of its own.
So the empty corridor turns out to be a deep human world spanning 12,000 years. It was also a node through which long-distance exchange moved for 1,000 miles and more. Not scenery, not background between the real centers. Fine, not late, not empty. But the familiar picture has another claim, that North America, when it came to crafts and inventions, was always trailing behind, receiving from elsewhere, lagging behind the better-known centers of the world. Was that true? Around 1 billion years ago, North America almost split in two. A huge rift began to tear across the continent. Then it stopped before finishing the job. The continent survived, but that failed rift left behind a strange inheritance, the largest concentration of native copper in the world around Lake Superior and on Isle Royale. Native copper means this wasn't ore that had to be smelted, it was already metal. Chunks and even masses of copper lying directly in the rock, sometimes so pure they could be hammered as they were, cold, without the long road of smelting and alloys that other parts of the world would travel much later. And that copper hits another familiar assumption about the continent, that North America was always behind, always receiving from outside, always trailing the better-known centers of the world. Because around the Great Lakes, people mined that copper and put it to use. Where it reached the surface, thousands of ancient pits remain. People knocked copper out of the rock with stone hammers, sometimes heating the stone and pouring water on it so it would crack. The metal itself was hammered cold into the needed shape, with occasional heating to keep it from splitting. From it came spear and dart points, knives, awls, fishhooks, axes, bracelets. And all of this happened thousands of years before most of the world had truly mastered metal. Not technology arrived from the south. This was local, early, on the spot. And here's the key detail. These were objects in people's hands, not museum curiosities. They're found beside people themselves, in lakeside cemeteries along the shores, in Wisconsin and around the region. A copper hook lies with the person who used it to fish. A copper knife, a copper awl, a copper point lie beside the people who worked with them and with whom they were placed in the ground after death. At first, copper was simply a tool, a little sharper, a little more reliable than stone. Then the story turns, and the turn is not upward. Copper did not lead in a straight line to some North American Bronze Age. Over time, it moved more and more out of work and into display. Ornaments, things worn to say, "This is who I am." Beads, bracelets, breastplates. Why? Part of the answer is about people. Status and display became more important than the work itself. Part of the answer is about the metal, and it's almost funny. The local copper was so pure that it often stayed too soft. A soft blade can't beat good stone in heavy everyday work. It bends. To make copper hard, you need to alloy it with something else. That's the road to bronze. But tin wasn't nearby, and the story was pulling in another direction. Too pure to be hard. In my view, that paradox is the most valuable part of the old copper story. It shows you can have technology without climbing someone else's ladder. North America didn't follow the universal classroom sequence of stone, then copper, then bronze. It made an early leap, and then it reached a different outcome. And that's more interesting than the smooth textbook model. It's local. It depends on circumstances. It's real. Fine. Not late. Not empty. Not behind. But the familiar picture has an even deeper belief, and it may be the oldest of all. Monuments and large structures arrived together with farming. First fields, then surplus, then and only then the kind of project that makes people gather and build. Is that true? The first answer lies in Louisiana, in mud where there is no stone at all. In the marshlands of Louisiana, where there's no local stone at all, 6 enormous earthen rings lie on the ground. They're concentric, nested inside one another, like ripples on water that were stopped in place and packed with earth. Along the edges stand large mounds. The outermost ring is about 0.6 miles across. If you straightened all 6 ridges into one line, you'd get close to 10 miles of earthen walls. and above them rises the main mound, Mound A, a mountain of earth as tall as a 7-story building, shaped vaguely like a bird. In the eastern part of the continent, only Cahokia would later surpass it in size, and Cahokia was still 2,000 years away. All of this is about 3,700 years old. By some measures, it was North America's first city. And for more than 1,000 years, it remained the only settlement of this scale north of Mesoamerica. And it was built by hunter-gatherers. No corn, no domesticated crop at all. The plant remains are all wild: persimmon, goosefoot, maygrass, sunflower. People ate them with venison, turkey, waterfowl, turtles, and above all, an astonishing abundance of fish from the surrounding wetlands. When the first archaeologists started digging at Poverty Point, they couldn't accept that.
The place had been known since the 1830s. A settler had come looking for a rumored lead mine and instead found, in his own words, a site of an old Indian town. The entire surface was covered with fired clay balls the size of a green walnut, and he rode straight up to a mound of colossal size. But when serious excavation began in the early 20th century, and the tools being pulled from the ground turned out to be archaic from the long era before settled farming, the excavators reached for explanations. First, conquerors from the north, then missionaries from the south, because their rule was simple: monumental earthworks and agriculture go together. The rule was wrong. Then the pendulum swung the other way. Maybe this was just a temporary fairground, a place where bands gathered to trade and feast. But the sheer mass of household refuse argued against that too. This was a residential city of gatherers. One researcher half-jokingly called it a glitch in the matrix. It wasn't a glitch. It was a peak. It was the high point of a habit of building with earth that was already ancient in the lower Mississippi Valley. The oldest known mounds in the region go back more than 7,000 years. Places like Watson Brake were raising rings of mounds 2,000 years before Porting Point. Some had similar layouts, similar proportions, even shared units of measure. And the labor wasn't impossible. A small community, if it has time, can raise a serious mound. The soil layers at Porting Point showed that the rings grew quickly in planned and coordinated stages as the population grew. This was a mountain of earth carried in baskets, one basket after another. And still, the main mound may have gone up in about 3 months. Here's the detail that brings daily life into focus.
Louisiana had no stone, so people cooked with clay. They shaped small balls and loaf-like pieces from earth, fired them, heated them, and dropped them into earth ovens. Clay holds heat. Archaeologists have recovered millions of these handmade lumps, traces of ordinary days, of hands kneading soft earth beside a fire. There are no burials in the mounds, by the way. That role would come to North American mounds later. Here, the dead were most likely cremated, which takes away one of archaeology's richest sources of evidence. And then comes the final twist. The one thing Poverty Point didn't have was stone, so they brought stone in. in enormous quantities. Flint, quartzite, copper, soapstone from Arkansas, Indiana, Illinois, Georgia. Georgia soapstone bowls alone are found in greater numbers than local pottery. Some material arrived as raw stone, some as rough blanks, to be turned here into points, scrapers, drills, hoes, and net weights. The place was almost a workshop for half a continent. And importantly, the goods seemed to have gone where they were needed. They didn't just pile up in the hands of an elite. A huge hunter-gatherer city fed by wild plants and fish, with no agriculture and no local stone, functioning as a continental exchange hub. Around 1000 BC, it was abandoned. North America wouldn't see anything like it in scale for another 1,000 years. Look at it through the eyes of the first excavators, and it's an anomaly. Look at it for what it was, and it's a peak. And it rhymes with something across the ocean and 7,000 years earlier, the logic of Göbekli Tepe. The monument didn't wait for the farm, it came first. If hunter-gatherers could do this, what could an entire continent build when it was stitched together by one network of ritual?
The answer lies in the river valleys of Ohio. In the river valleys of Ohio, especially around Chillicothe, earthworks still lie on the landscape that are so large and so geometrically precise that European colonists, when they first measured them, refused to believe Native Americans had built them. So they invented an entire vanished race of mound builders. Atlanteans, a lost tribe of Israel, someone from the old world, anyone as long as it wasn't the indigenous people living right there. The real builders were the people archaeologists call the Hopewell tradition. Not a kingdom, not even a single people, a loose web of communities spread across the eastern woodlands roughly from 100 BC to 500 AD, tied together by a shared body of ritual, art, and exchange. They lived in tiny settlements of 1 to 3 households. They hunted, gathered, and gardened a little. They had leaders, but not the kind who could command an army of earth movers. And yet they raised geometry that still stuns people today. The Newark earthworks alone covered more than 4 square miles. The octagonal enclosure there is more than 50 acres, connected by parallel walls to a precise circle and aligned to the 18.6-year cycle of the moon. To the major lunar standstill, the moment when the moon rises at the farthest point of its long swing. It's such a subtle phenomenon that you can only recognize it by watching the horizon for generations. Other Hopewell earthworks encode sunrise points at solstices and equinoxes. In 2023, 12 of these Ohio monuments were added together to the UNESCO World Heritage List. Hopewell burials show another side of the story, and it's sharper.
This was not a world of simple equality. Most people were cremated. The mound was for the few. Judging by the objects, often for those honored for hunting prowess. They were placed in graves lined with woven matting, with mica, sometimes with stone, and with objects that read almost like a map of the whole continent. Obsidian in Ohio graves came from Obsidian Cliff in what is now Yellowstone, 2,000 miles away in one direction. Copper came from the Great Lakes. Mica came from the southern Appalachians. Marine shells and shark teeth came from the coasts. Remember the thread from the Plains story, Knife River flint traveling all the way to the Ohio mounds. This is the network it traveled through. And in one grave, almost the whole continent was present. Black volcanic glass from the west, glittering mica from the mountains, shells that still carried the memory of salt water. From these materials, Hopewell craftspeople made objects so finely worked that they stand beside the best art of ancient America. In the Mound of Pipes at Mound City alone, more than 200 stone smoking pipes were found, carved as animals and birds with confident three-dimensional form. There were copper falcons and headdresses hammered from the back, masks carved over human skulls, and the famous mica hand, a hand cut from a single transparent sheet of mica 11 inches long. Why? No one knows. Part of a shaman's costume? Something carried in ritual? A sign whose meaning we can no longer decode? One thing is clear: it was made to be seen. And finished objects traveled back through the network. Pipes in the Ohio style have been found as burial offerings far from Ohio. A continent stitched together by ritual demand for the rare and distant, centuries before any city rose in the eastern woodlands. And then, around AD 500, it ended.
Exchange stopped. Mound building halted. Recognizable art forms disappeared. The reasons are still debated more than known. Climate shifts may have moved game and broken up predictable lifeways. The bow and arrow may have made hunting too efficient and warfare too cheap, so that late woodland villages soon began crowding behind palisades and ditches. A slow turn toward full-scale corn agriculture may have made the old broad network less necessary for self-sufficient communities. And when fewer feet traveled the routes, the traditions and specialized knowledge that moved with them simply faded in a self-reinforcing decline. The earthworks remained. They sank under grass, then under the plow. And the lesson Hopewell leaves is the same one embodied in its monuments. A monumental, astronomical, continental achievement did not require kings, cities, or grain agriculture. It required a shared idea and the will of scattered communities to return to it again and again. From that same Ohio world, or somewhere close to it at the edge of time and space, comes its strangest relative, the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County. On a narrow, high plateau above Brush Creek, a giant earthen snake winds along the ridge, about a quarter-mile long. It's the largest known effigy mound, an animal-shaped mound, anywhere in the world. Its body is built of yellowish clay and ash over a layer of stone. The tail curls into a tight triple spiral. The head opens around an oval about 120 feet long, which the first surveyors, Squire and Davis in 1848, read as an egg the serpent was about to swallow. And here's the key detail about this serpent. You can only see its shape from above, from the air, or from an observation tower. From the ground, it's just a low, winding ridge, disappearing into the grass. Almost everything else about it is disputed, starting with the simplest question: who built it and when? Two cultures are in play, separated by more than 1,000 years. On one side is Adena, around 1000 BC.
Their burial mounds stand nearby, and one carbon-14 study placed the serpent around 300 BC, although critics have challenged that date because the sample didn't come from the most reliable layers. On the other side is the much later Fort Ancient culture around the turn of the 1st and 2nd millennium AD. Fort Ancient people did build animal-shaped mounds, and they favored serpent imagery. Edina, as far as we know, did not. Charcoal taken directly from ash at the site produced dates around the 11th to 13th centuries. A similar serpent in Canada, by the way, appears to be more than 2,000 years old and is linked to Edina, so the early version of the story is still alive. The honest answer is this: we don't yet know whose hands first laid that shape along the ridge. The geometry invites an astronomical reading. The end with the head and oval seems to point toward sunset on the summer solstice. The coiled tail points toward sunrise on the winter solstice. The larger curves of the body have been linked to sunrises, equinoxes, and moonrise points, although the sight lines are short and flexible enough that scholars stay cautious. These alignments have produced a long chain of guesses about some sky event that may have inspired the mound. The favorite is Halley's Comet, which burned brightly in the sky in 1066, only a few years before the proposed construction date, around 1070. The bright supernova of 1054 has also been suggested. None of this can be proved.
And there's one more strange layer. The plateau itself sits on the eroded scar of an ancient meteor impact. It's a crater about 9 miles wide, blasted out 250 million years ago and worn down long before anyone built there. The builders almost certainly didn't know what lay beneath them. What they had was a commanding ridge exactly where you'd place a monument meant to be seen. In the 1880s, Harvard's Frederick Ward Putnam saved the mound from plowing with money from Boston patrons. He excavated it, and he used his finds, Hopewell pipes and ear spools, Edina gorgets and points, to argue for the permanent protection of the site. And precisely because so much about it remains unresolved, Serpent Mound became a magnet for every kind of fantasy. It has been credited to lost civilizations, ancient astronauts, reptilians, anyone except the people who actually chose a dramatic ridge and shaped 1/4 mile of Earth into one coherent image, very possibly tied to the sun. That ongoing argument is a lesson too. It shows how hard it is to read intention from Earth alone, and how easily a real indigenous achievement gets buried under stories about everyone except its creators. The arid East was saying this: the monument does not wait for the farm, the king, or the city. The desert Southwest gives two different answers to a harder question. How do you hold a society together where the land itself doesn't help you but fights you? One answer is sacred architecture. The other is water. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, there's a canyon where almost nothing grows. Winter is brutal. Summer is dry. There's no construction timber. Water arrives on the schedule of rare rains. No one in their right mind would build the largest structure on the continent here. But someone did. And not just one structure, not for 10 years, for 3 centuries.
This is Chaco Canyon.
From about AD 850 to 1150, it was the heart of something we still don't have a precise word for. Pueblo Bonito, the main one of its great houses, had 600 or 700 rooms, rising 4 or 5 stories, built according to a plan that generations of masons had to hold in their minds. The masonry was so refined that builders laid a smooth facing over a rubble core, almost like a veneer, even though the whole surface was later plastered. It was one of the largest structures in ancient North America. It stayed that way for centuries. And now comes the oddity that begins every investigation of Chaco. Almost nobody lived in these giant houses. Archaeologists long called Chaco a city out of habit. Big buildings meant city. But when they counted hearths, trash middens, burials, and traces of everyday cooking and sleeping, the numbers didn't fit. At any given time, reasonable estimates put the population of the canyon at no more than a couple thousand people, and possibly much less. Many rooms in the great houses stood empty or served as storage. Even the household trash that dense ordinary life leaves behind is too scarce for a city. So you get the absurdity: monumental construction for centuries and almost no townspeople. To understand who was building all this, you have to look at what runs outward from Chaco. First, the wood. There's no construction timber in Chaco. The nearest mountains with suitable pine and fir are 40–45 miles away. From there, people carried into the canyon by hand, without wheels and without pack animals, something like 200,000 logs. Each one was felled, trimmed, dried, and carried across the desert. Not one burst of emergency labor, a steady flow across generations. Then the roads.
Straight, broad strips run out from Chaco. They were cleared, sometimes edged and marked with structures. The most famous, the Great North Road, runs several dozen miles almost due north and ends basically nowhere, at a cliff on the edge of another canyon. It doesn't connect two settlements by the shortest practical route, the way a road for hauling goods would. It stays straight where it would be easier to bend. It goes north for the sake of north. Where a rock face blocked the way, people cut stairs into it rather than turn aside. This wasn't a transportation network. It was a statement. A line drawn across the land to mean something. The roads, the architecture, and the pottery all extend far beyond the canyon, across the San Juan Basin, over thousands of square miles. More than 70 Chacoan outliers stand, buildings in the same great house style, clearly made from the same idea. One of them, Chimney Rock, sits high in Colorado, positioned so that the full moon rises between two stone spires standing side by side. But not every month. It happens about once every 18.5 years, when the moon reaches the farthest point of its long swing. Remember the Newark octagon, aligned to that same 18.6-year lunar cycle, half a continent away and centuries earlier. Those people and these people didn't know each other, but both built in ways that captured the same rare movement of the moon, the one you can't notice unless you watch the horizon for generations. The idea itself that something important in the sky should be written into the ground moves across this continent from community to community. And the most delicate of these instruments is in the canyon itself, on top of Fajada Butte, an isolated rock formation. There, 3 heavy stone slabs lean against a cliff face. Behind them, a spiral is carved into the stone.
Around midday, sunlight squeezes between the slabs and falls across the spiral as a narrow, shining wedge, the sun dagger. On the summer solstice, the wedge passes exactly through the center of the spiral. On the equinoxes and the winter solstice, the light falls differently, along the edges and in pairs. In plain terms, someone built a calendar into the rock with no moving parts, designed so that the sun itself would mark the right day once a year. And it worked for more than 1,000 years. It was only noticed in 1977. By 1989, it had broken, not from time, from us. Year after year, people walked up the butte to see it. The soil beneath the slabs settled and shifted, and one slab moved just enough that the dagger no longer fell where it needed to. The hill was closed after that. For 1,000 years, the instrument kept count of the days. It didn't survive a decade of outside footsteps. To me, there is no sharper image of Chaco than that. An enormous, careful system built to last for centuries, and how easily it breaks when people stop understanding it. And something else reached Chaco from far away, from the south. At Pueblo Bonito, archaeologists have found the skeletons of scarlet macaws, parrots whose wild range comes no closer than tropical Mexico. They found traces of cacao in narrow, distinctive jars, the kind of drink prepared in Mesoamerican cities. Turquoise was worked here in large quantities and sent out through exchange networks. Chaco didn't only look north along its straight road, it sat on the far northern edge of a world that reached all the way down to Mesoamerica. Put all of this together and the absurdity starts to resolve. Chaco was not a city where people lived, it was a place people came to, the ritual heart of an entire region.
The great houses were built and visited by a population scattered across the plateau, people with no king and no army. They built for generations according to a shared plan. They carried timber across the desert. They drew straight roads. They caught the moon and sun with stone. They traded for parrots from neighbors 600 miles away. This was not some backward farming village. It was a coordinated religious system the size of half a modern state, with engineering, astronomy, and long-distance trade, assembled without coercion. Then, in the 1130s, a long and brutal drought came to the southwest. What happened next is debated. Did drought cripple a system that depended on good harvests? Did trust collapse in the people who promised that rituals in the canyon brought rain? Did both things happen at once? One thing is clear. By the mid-12th century, the center of gravity had left the canyon. But the people did not disappear. They moved to the Rio Grande, west toward the future Hopi, south toward the future Zuni. Their descendants, the Pueblo peoples, still live there today. For many of them, Chaco is not a textbook ruin, it's an ancestral place with a name and a memory. The great houses stand empty. The people who imagined them do not. And again, the same motif returns, one we've seen more than once in this investigation. Again and again, the people of North America build something large and carefully coordinated, and its ending leaves us not with a period, but with a question. Chaco was an answer to the desert through sacred architecture.
hold people together by giving them a shared sky and a shared place where everyone goes. But that wasn't the only answer the desert forced from the people who lived in it.
Farther west and south, the same problem: how to build society where the land itself is against you, was solved not with an altar, but with a shovel. There, people reshaped water itself. Phoenix, Arizona is the fifth largest city in the United States, and beneath it lie irrigation canals that Phoenix didn't dig. They were cut 1,000 years before the city existed, along the same routes. The first American settlers simply cleared the old canals, sent water through them again, and built on top of them. The city even chose the right name for itself: Phoenix, the bird that rises from the ashes. From the ashes of a people who engineered this desert long before America arrived. We call that people the Hohokam, a word from the language of the O'odham who still live here. It roughly means those who are finished, or those who were used up. And the desert they tamed was the Sonoran Desert, the floor of the Phoenix Valley. Less than 8 inches of rain a year, with summer temperatures pushing 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Corn arrived here very early, a couple of thousand years before Christ, but turning this furnace into a breadbasket was something else entirely. And from roughly the middle of the first millennium AD, for more than 1,000 years, one of the largest irrigation systems in the ancient world operated here. The numbers are worth saying out loud. Hundreds of miles of canals, main channels several yards wide, with the largest ones still wider still, stretching for miles from the Gila and Salt rivers. From them ran smaller distribution ditches, then still smaller ones all the way out to the fields. Tens of thousands of acres under irrigation, and all of it was dug and repaired with wooden and stone tools. No metal, no draft animals, no wheel. And it wasn't dug once and left alone. It was cleaned, recut, adjusted and rebuilt hundreds of times over the centuries, because a canal silts up, a bank collapses, a river changes its mind. By some estimates, one major canal alone took something like 1 million person-days of labor. And here's the central Hohokam puzzle. It isn't about engineering, it's about power. A system like this has to be imagined as a whole. The slope has to be held almost inch by inch over miles, or the water won't move, or it will tear the channel apart. People have to agree on who gets how much water and when. Every year, workers have to be brought together to clean the canals. That's state-level work. But there was no state. No king, no treasury, no capital collecting tribute. Archaeologists keep digging and they don't find the ruling class that should have been commanding all of this. The Hohokam didn't have state-style power, but they did state-scale work. We don't really know how they held it together. We can only see what it seems to have gathered around. Across the region stand more than 200 so-called ball courts, long earthen basins related to the Mesoamerican ball game. It looks like communities from different canal systems met there. They played, they traded, they negotiated. The Hohokam in general looked south.
Archaeologists find copper bells and scarlet macaws from Mexico, and the Hohokam themselves made fine red-on-buff pottery and etched designs into marine shells from the Gulf of California. That was a trick few people in the ancient world managed to repeat. They covered the design with resin, then etched the surrounding surface with a weak acid made from fermented cactus juice. A desert with almost nothing in it. And out of it came cotton, embroidered textiles, carved shell, turquoise. Then, beginning around the 12th century, the rivers started behaving differently. Sometimes they cut their beds too deep, leaving the old canals hanging above the waterline, useless. Other times they came out in catastrophic floods. And as the rivers changed, society itself changed with it. The ball courts went out of use. In their place, people built platform mounds, and things happened on top of them that not everyone was allowed to attend. Walled compounds appeared. Casa Grande rose, the great house, a 4-story tower of compacted earth, with an opening in the wall that catches the sun on a few specific days of the year. It was this long-abandoned building that the first Europeans saw and named Casa Grande. A ruling class that had once been almost invisible now clearly separated itself from everyone else. Connections shifted away from the Mesoamerican south and toward the Pueblo north. Painted pottery came from that direction, and probably migrants as well. A society that had managed for 1,000 years without visible bosses began to acquire them under stress. It didn't save them. By the middle of the 15th century, before a single European appeared in this region, the great canals had stopped running. The fields were abandoned, the population scattered. Most likely, several disasters converged. Decades of droughts and destructive floods, soil that had been irrigated for centuries and had grown salty because of it, and a society under so much pressure that the old agreement, everyone turns out to clean the canal, no longer held. The valley emptied out. But as with Chaco, emptied out does not mean vanished. The descendants of the Hohokam did not disappear. They are the O'odam, the river Pima along the Gila and Salt, and the desert Tohono in the uplands. It is their word, Hohokam, that we use for the ancient builders of these canals. And the canals outlived everyone. When American settlers arrived here in the 19th century and began thinking about how to irrigate this land, it turned out they didn't have to think very hard. The routes had already been laid out. The slope had already been checked 1,000 years earlier. They cleared the Hohokam channels and water flowed through them again. Modern Phoenix drinks and irrigates through a grid that at its foundation was not laid out by American engineers. So the Hohokam didn't merely survive in the desert, they beat it, so completely that their work still supports a modern American metropolis, while most of its residents have no idea. Chaco answered the desert with a temple and a shared sky. The Hohokam answered it with a shovel and shared water. Two different solutions to the same problem: how to bring people together where the land is against you. And all this time, one more question has been hanging over the investigation, the boldest one of all. Fine, footprints older than the glacial maximum, a monument before farming, continental networks without kings, a sacred capital, a desert garden. But could North America before Europeans build a real, large, dense city? Or was that exactly what it never had? The answer stands on the east bank of the Mississippi, across from modern St. Louis, and it's bigger than it looks. St. Louis was once called Mound City. The mounds are gone now. They were torn down in the 19th century, their soil hauled away to fill ravines and build railroad embankments. By the end of that century, almost nothing remained of the dozens of mounds inside the city limits. But those mounds were there for a reason. Directly across the Mississippi once stood the largest city North America had ever built before Europeans arrived. St. Louis grew on the western edge of its sprawling suburb.
It destroyed those mounds. We call that city Cahokia, after a tribe that lived in the area much later and had no direct connection to the city itself. Its real name is unknown to us, and it appeared almost suddenly. Archaeologists speak of a Big Bang around AD 1050. On the broad floodplain where the Mississippi meets the Missouri and the Illinois, a planned city rose in the span of 1 or 2 generations. Plazas, mounds, neighborhoods, all oriented according to a single design. It didn't grow slowly out of a village. It was conceived and built. How large was it? At its height, roughly 10,000 to 20,000 people lived in the city itself, and more if you count the surrounding settlements on the same floodplain. By the standards of its century, it was larger than London at the time. And no city in what is now the United States would surpass Cahokia in population until Philadelphia near the end of the 18th century. At the center stood Monk's Mound. It is a stepped earthen mountain as tall as a 10-story building, wider at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, with a volume of more than 20 million cubic feet. That entire mountain is earth, carried in woven baskets, basket after basket. Cahokia had about 120 mounds in all. In front of the main mound, people cleared and leveled the Grand Plaza by hand, about 50 acres of flat ground. Nearby, they set up Woodhenge, a circle of cedar posts more than 300 feet across, used to track sunrise on key days of the year. People played on that plaza. The game was called Chunky. One player rolled a stone disc across the packed ground. The others threw spears after it, trying to predict where the disc would stop and land, their spear as close as possible. It sounds like a pastime. But on carved stone gorgets found hundreds of miles from Cahokia, the figure shown is the chunky player, disc in one hand, spears in the other. Cahokia didn't just play its game, it sent the game out. And with the game, it sent out its image across a large part of the continent. At its peak, this was not some curiosity on the margins, it was a center of gravity. And now the dark piece of evidence, the one without which the portrait would be dishonest. In one of the 120 mounds, numbered by archaeologists as Mound 72, lie more than 250 people. At the heart of the burial, one person was placed on a bed of roughly 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird, perhaps a falcon or a falcon man. Another person lay nearby. Around them were other burials,
and among them are things that are hard to describe evenly. Rows of young women laid down in layers, dozens at a time, apparently strangled. A group of people killed by blows and decapitated, and some bodies whose fingers clawed at the sand the way fingers claw when a person is being buried alive. Not everyone placed in that mound was dead when they went in. There's no calm way to explain this, and there doesn't need to be. Mound 72 is power that can order people into a grave, and the order is obeyed. That is not rare in human societies, unfortunately. What is rare is that the earth preserved it in such detail. And still, reducing Cahokia to this mound would be as false as reducing it to its numbers. The same packed earth held a calendar in cedar posts, a game in the plaza, seasonal order, and the ordinary life of a huge city, markets.
Around 1175, a palisade rose around Cahokia's center, a wall about 2 miles in perimeter, requiring roughly 20,000 logs with towers at regular intervals. It was rebuilt several times. A city with no one to fear does not build walls. What exactly went wrong is still debated. Maybe the surrounding area was exhausted after a century of pulling firewood and grain into one place for so many people. Maybe the climate shifted. Maybe the thing that held people under a power capable of Mound 72 began to collapse from within. Maybe all of it happened at once. By the middle of the 14th century, Cahokia was empty, long before any European reached the area. Those who left became part of other peoples. The Osage, Omaha, Ponca, and Quapaw are often named among their descendants. And over the empty floodplain, the mounds stood for another 500 years, until St. Louis grew across the river and tore down its own mounds to fill ravines. So the question that has been hanging over this investigation from the start gets a direct answer. Could the continent before Europeans build a real city? Yes, it could. It did. A large, planned city with a monument wider at the base than the Great Pyramid, with a plaza, a calendar, a BAME adopted 1,000 miles away, and a dark side of the kind large societies have everywhere. And it was built, by the way, not by outsiders and not by some vanished race. The same habit of building with earth that began in the Louisiana wetlands 3,000 years before Cahokia reached its peak here. A city, a sacred capital, a desert turned into a garden, a lost metropolis. Already we have 4 different ways to be a complex society, and not one of them matches the textbook ladder. But one more is still ahead, and it strikes at the oldest assumption of all, the one we started with when we began taking this picture apart.
That complex society, chiefs, tribute, and cities require grain. They require farming. In southwest Florida lived a people who built power, a fleet, and a capital with almost no planted fields at all. The sea fed them. In 1896, on a tiny island off the southwest coast of Florida, archaeologist Frank Cushing dug into black, waterlogged mud and pulled out things that should not have survived. Wood, wooden masks, painted boards, handles, animal figures.
Things that rot away in ordinary soil within a generation had lain here in oxygen-poor muck for 500 years or more, like in a wet safe. The most famous find was a small figure, half human, half panther, seated with its paws tucked in, calm as a temple sculpture. The Key Marco cat. It is about 5 centuries old, and it looks as if it were carved last month. And here comes the bitter part. In 1896, the techniques needed to preserve ancient wet wood did not yet exist. Objects lifted from the muck began to dry in the open air. Many warped, cracked, and crumbled into dust within hours. Cushing saw this and did the only thing he could. He had an artist with him at the excavation, and the artist painted each object as soon as it came out of the ground. For half of them, that watercolor is the only thing that remains. Archaeology usually deals with things that survived thousands of years. Here, it was dealing with things that might not survive until evening. And this isn't just a sad episode about conservation. In miniature, it is the whole problem with the people who left the cat behind. Their prower was made of wood, shells, fish, and nets, things that don't fossilize, things that rot. They were erased quickly. They left no fields behind them, no stone temples for tourists either. So in the familiar picture of North America, they are almost invisible. But they were a kingdom.
These people were the Calusa, and they lived among the estuaries and islands of southwest Florida. And here is the first thing to know about them. They were not farmers. By all evidence, the Calusa did no serious crop growing at all. And not because they didn't know how or hadn't reached that stage. When the Spanish, trying to civilize them, offered agricultural tools and seeds, the Calusa refused. They didn't need them. By some estimates, more than 9/10 of their food energy came from the water, fish, shellfish, conchs, and all the abundance of the shallow lagoons. The estuary was their field, and it was enough not merely to survive. It was enough for power. Because the Calusa had a paramount chief who received tribute from dozens of subordinate towns, fish, hides, captives, and later gold and silver stripped from Spanish ships wracked along these coasts. They had a fleet of war canoes with which they controlled the shoreline, and they had a capital, Mound Key, Kalos in Spanish, an island built up by human hands from billions of shells, with canals, plazas, and water courts. These were enclosed areas of water where, as recent excavations have shown, live fish were kept in reserve to feed people gathering at the center. On this island, according to Spanish descriptions, stood the chief's house, large enough to hold 2,000 people. Not a fishing village, a state built on an estuary. And unlike Cahokia or Chaco, we know this state not only from potsherds. Outsiders saw it and described it. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon approached Florida, the same man whose name would later be attached to the legend of the Fountain of Youth. The Calusa met him in battle on the water. When he returned in 1521, this time intending to found a colony, a Calusa arrow struck him in the thigh. He soon died from the wound in Cuba.
The man who discovered Florida did not conquer it. Florida killed him. Half a century later, Pedro Lenéndez de Avilés, the founder of St. Augustine, tried another approach. He married into the chief's house, placed a garrison and a mission nearby and gave the chief a Christian name, Carlos. That didn't work either. The mission was destroyed. The Spanish were driven out. The Calusa held out against the most powerful empire in the world for almost 200 years, longer than nearly anyone else on this continent. In the end, weapons did not break them. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, European epidemics rolled through Florida, and local people had no protection against them. From the north came slave-raiding parties, native war bands armed by the English in Carolina, hunting people for sale. Between disease and raids, the Calusa dwindled. By the middle of the 15th century, they no longer existed as a major force. The last of them went to the Florida Keys and then on to Cuba. The estuary that had fed a kingdom for 1,000 years was left without its kingdom. Now put the whole line together. Footprints in gypsum, older than the last glacial maximum. 12,000 years of life on the supposedly empty plains. Copper in human hands thousands of years before foreign metallurgy. A hunter-gatherer city without a single planted field. A sacred capital raised in the desert. That same desert reshaped into a garden with canals without metal. A metropolis on the Mississippi larger than London at the time, and a kingdom of fish and shells with a fleet and tribute that fought off Spain for 200 years. These are different answers to one question: how to hold a society together, how to become something larger than a family around a fire. And not one of them follows that ladder. First fields, then surplus, then cities, then kings. Complexity, as it turns out, doesn't always smell like grain. Sometimes it smells like salt. And if there are this many answers, and they are this different from one another, then this is no chain of accidents. It is a pattern. Which means it is time to return to the first question, the one this whole investigation began with, even before the white gypsum. Not, did North America have a past worth being amazed by? That much is clear now. The more uncomfortable question is this: how did this enormous, loud, 1,000-year past get made to look so small? So how? How did all of this get turned into empty plains, bison, and scattered tribes? It didn't happen by itself. In effect, people worked at it. In different ways, not always on purpose, but they worked at it. The first method was to tell a better story. In the 19th century, as settlers across the eastern United States kept running into huge earthworks, a quick and convenient explanation appeared. The mounds had been built by some vanished superior race, a lost tribe of Israel, migrants from the Old World, anyone at all. Then that race was wiped out by savages, the very Indians living nearby. This story was not harmless. It lined up almost perfectly with the policy of Indian removal. If noble mound builders had once been slaughtered by Indians, then removing Indians now was simply history repeating itself. The land seemed to be returning to its true owner. It took decades of excavation to settle the argument. Finally, in 1894, a Smithsonian Institution report said it directly. The mounds were built by the ancestors of living native peoples. There had been no vanished race. But by then, the vanished race had already been soaked into books, novels, and the general picture for a century. The achievement was handed to a ghost, then forgotten with the ghost. The second method was cruder: demolish it. The mounds of St. Louis were hauled away by the wagon load for railroad embankments. The largest of them, literally called Big Mound, was leveled completely in 1869 and used for roadbed fill. In the 19th century, Monk's Mound at Cahokia nearly got sold off for development. Across the Midwest, thousands of earthen figures were flattened by plows in just a few generations. What took centuries to build could disappear in a single season of farming. And the sun dagger at Chaco, which had stood for 1,000 years, was damaged further by the feet of people who came to look at it. A monument that no longer exists is easy to treat as unimportant. After all, it's gone. And the third was not even a method exactly. It was the unfairness of the material itself. Cahokia and Chaco left earthen mountains and stone walls. At least you can see those. But the Calusa built from wood, shells, fish, and nets. The Hohokam built with water in a ditch. And when they were gone, and gone quickly, between epidemics and slave raids, sometimes within the lifetime of 1 or 2 generations, they left behind very little that survives for centuries. By the time the textbook was written, there was almost nothing left with which to see them. And silence in the source is easy to mistake for emptiness in the past. Put those 3 things together: a ghost given someone else's glory, monuments torn down and plowed under, peoples erased too quickly to leave a stone trace, and you get exactly the neat little picture we started with: empty plains, late arrival, simple tribes, a convenient picture and a false one. Because after white sands, footprints older than the glacial maximum, after Poverty Point, a city without a single planted field, after Hopewell, a continental network without a king, with obsidian and mica moving across half a continent and the 18.6-year cycle of the moon marked on the ground, after Chaco, a sacred capital raised in the desert, after the Hohokam, a desert turned into a garden, after Cahokia, a metropolis larger than London at the time, after the Calusa, a kingdom of fish and shells that held off Spain for 200 years. After all of that, the question no longer sounds like something asked at a classroom chalkboard. It sounds almost like an accusation. North America before Columbus was not an empty stage waiting for real history to begin. It was real history. A continent where, for thousands of years, people ran the same experiment in different ways: how to hold together, how to become something larger than a family around a fire. An archive whose pages are made of packed earth, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, and a road you cannot see until you rise above it. The archive is not empty. It was simply kept closed for a very long time. So the question at the end is not, was there a past here worth being amazed by? We've just turned through some of its pages. There was, and then some. The question is different, and it is not a comfortable one. How did such an enormous, loud, 1,000-year past get made to look so small? And the next time someone says that before Europeans this place was empty, late, and simple, remember where we began. with children's footprints in white gypsum more than 20,000 years old. They were here. They were always here.